Taehyung's voice shattered the calm like glass hitting marble. "Don't touch him." The words didn't boom, they fractured, trembling with a rawness that backstage walls were never built to contain. His fist struck the concrete pillar beside him, not from anger, but desperation wearing anger's mask. The sound was dull, violent, echoing through the labyrinth of corridors behind the main arena stage in Seoul's Gachyeok Sky Dome, where the air smelled of hairspray, overheated wires, and the metallic tang of stress no fan would ever see from the seats. Jungkook was already on the ground by then, unconscious, pale under lights that felt crueler than cameras. His body looked wrong without motion, like someone paused a video mid-breath. Taehyung dropped to his knees beside him, heart hammering like a second percussion track no one asked for, his breathing jagged and uneven. Blood painted Taehyung's knuckles, but it hadn't come from the pillar. It came from earlier. Earlier when the world was still noisy. Earlier when he thought he could swallow everything without choking. The staff hesitated around him, a strange constellation of stylists, audio engineers, security personnel, all suspended between protocol and panic. Hoseok had sprinted to the emergency panel, calling medical assistance, voice sharp and clipped like a metronome skipping beats. Namjoon's commands came from the far end of the hallway, calm but slicing, organizing the chaos into a shape that resembled control. Seokjin had been pulled into a conversation with a stage manager minutes before the incident, unaware the crisis had already detonated. Jimin, standing near the production desk earlier, had witnessed the first crack in Taehyung. But this crack was different. This one threatened to collapse the pillars of everything they had built. Taehyung leaned closer to Jungkook's face, his hand hovering above Jungkook's shoulder, suspended with fear that touching him would somehow break the moment further. "Wake up," Taehyung whispered, voice splitting like thin ice. "Please, stay with me." His eyes glimmered with unshed tears, emotions churning into a storm that drowned reason. The night had begun like any other. Thousands of screaming fans, rehearsed choreography, synchronized glances across the stage, smiles that masked exhaustion. But Jungkook's smile had flickered earlier, winced when turning his head slightly to the right. Taehyung had noticed. He always noticed. He noticed everything and said nothing until it became too loud to contain. The confrontation had begun when Jungkook murmured, "I saw the file, T. I know what you're hiding." Those words detonated Taehyung's judgment. Not with violence, but with emotion so powerful it swallowed judgment whole. A chair thrown, a light shattered, words shouted that could never be retracted. Jungkook's body buckled when he collapsed, not from the chair, but from something unseen, from a medical condition only hinted at in rehearsals. The paramedics arrived like thunder, separating Taehyung from Jungkook with gentle but unbreakable intent. "Sir," one medic said firmly, "let us work." Taehyung stumbled back, costume still clinging to him like a past identity he couldn't peel off. A staff member whispered, "Was it a seizure?" "No," another replied, "he hit his head when he fell." "Did Taehyung?" "No," came the answer quickly. "He didn't touch him." The ambulance rolled Jungkook away. The sirens screamed. Then silence returned like an accusation. Taehyung sat on the dressing room floor 20 minutes later, still in costume, hands raw and trembling, staring into a cracked mirror that fractured his reflection into someone unrecognizable. The file. Tokyo, her. The girl Mina. The trainee who vanished 5 years ago without a goodbye or explanation. The same Mina Jungkook had mentioned earlier. The one Taehyung had buried behind silence thicker than NDAs. He closed his eyes and saw the Tokyo skyline where it began unraveling. Jungkook had flown there for a press tour. Taehyung received a call that night, voice trembling like shredded silk. "She's back." Taehyung didn't need details. Mina had appeared in Tokyo's rehearsal building with forged documents, fabricated proof, emotional detonations dressed like revelations. Blackmail disguised as closure. Taehyung finally understood why Jungkook's smile looked delayed. It wasn't choreography stiffness. It was fear sharpening into collapse. The managers demanded narrative control. HYBE demanded answers. The media demanded villains. Taehyung had none to offer except guilt and half-truths. Taehyung, the sound engineer who had known Taehyung since debut days, entered the dressing room softly but sharply. "They want to talk to you." "Who?" The staff, the managers, HYBE. I need to go to the hospital, Taehyung muttered. Not yet, came the reply. Media outside, police outside, statements first. What if the truth ruins everything? Jungkook might not wake up to ruin, Taehyung said quietly. He might wake up to betrayal's headlines. The words pierced like precision audio spikes. Hoseok stood in the meeting room packing like a conductor who had lost the orchestra. Namjoon watched Taehyung enter, gaze unbroken, leader posture carved from decisions heavier than microphones. This ends here, Namjoon said. No more leaks, no more speculation, no more silence. We can't stop what's circulating, a manager said. Then we drown it with truth, Hoseok replied. All of it. Taehyung clenched his fists. I'm done hiding. They arranged the live broadcast not through HYBE lines but through a private uplink at a rented production studio near Han River. A dark room. One camera. No script. No filter. Taehyung sat centered like an idol who had dropped the idol armor. I'm Kim Taehyung, he began, and I want to speak without anyone editing what I say. He inhaled sharply. 5 years ago, I had a relationship with someone I met during training. It wasn't appropriate. I was young, reckless, convinced everything I touched would last forever. He paused. I broke that illusion. I broke her. I didn't stop it when I should have. He leaned closer. But I did not threaten her. I did not send people to hurt her. I did not force anything. The internet exploded. Hashtags shifted. Narrative trembled. Contracts trembled. Truth sharpened its teeth. The ICU doors didn't open. They exhaled. A soft hydraulic sigh, sterile and reverent, as if the building itself understood the gravity of the moment and decided not to argue. The hallway behind Taehyung had been a battlefield of noise minutes earlier, but here, in the critical care wing of Seoul National University Hospital's private ICU annex, even footsteps sounded guilty if they tried to speak too loudly. The scent changed first. Sharp antiseptic, distilled metal, cold glass, a hint of saline mist from humidifiers working overtime to keep lungs alive. The second thing that changed was scale. Backstage arenas make idols feel small compared to the crowd. Hospitals make everyone feel small compared to a heartbeat. Taehyung entered alone, but not by choice. Namjoon had stopped at the outer doors, exchanging clipped words with the charge nurse and the internal HYBE medical compliance officer, who was trying to negotiate access like it was still a matter of schedules, releases, and optics. But Taehyung had already slipped past them when the first approval stamp landed. He moved like someone whose soul was leading and whose body was trying to catch up. His stage outfit was still on, cream silk shirt half untucked, black slacks scuffed at the knees, one of his earrings missing, likely sacrificed to the earlier chaos. His hair, still lightly set for broadcast shine, now looked wrong in this context, too glossy for a world that was suddenly matte, monochrome, and fragile. The spotlights that once crowned him king had turned into clinical LEDs that exposed him human. Jungkook was already stabilized, but stabilization in an ICU is a relative mercy. His body was horizontal, framed by guard rails and tubing that made him look more engineered than alive, though life was undeniably present in the gentle oscillation of his chest. An oxygen cannula rested under his nose, a cardiac telemetry patch constellation mapped across his sternum, a pulse oximeter clipped to his index finger like a digital wedding band to reality. IV lines fed into his forearm, nutrients and hydration marching into his bloodstream like reinforcements sent to a city under siege. His face was pale but peaceful in a way that hurt Taehyung more than chaos ever could. Peace looked like the aftermath of war, not the promise of safety. A nurse named So-min adjusted the infusion pump quietly, her voice barely above the register of breathing. He's stable, but unconscious. Let him rest. Taehyung nodded once. He didn't trust his voice not to break the moment further. His eyes did the speaking instead, dark irises reflecting monitors' data. Graphs, BPM readings, all translating into one sentence, alive but barely negotiated. Taehyung stepped closer, chair legs whispering against linoleum as he pulled a seat beside the bed. The nurse didn't stop him. The nurse only ensured the moment didn't fracture again. His hand reached for Jungkook's. This time he touched, skin to skin. It was cold but not glass, cold as human, cold as alive. Taehyung's thumb moved first, tracing slow circles over Jungkook's hand, ritualistic and grounding. "You absolute idiot," he whispered, but affection had replaced the venom. "Why did you try to save me when I was the one killing myself?" The words were a confession addressed to a sleeping man who might carry them better than Taehyung could awake. Silence responded for Jungkook. Silence and a monitor beep that sounded like punctuation. Hoseok appeared behind the glass partition, palms together, lips moving in a prayer rhythm that had nothing to do with religion and everything to do with bargaining with fate. Jimin stood beside him, eyes glossy, leaning his shoulder against the cold wall, grounding himself in physical contact with a building that didn't lie, didn't leak, didn't spin narratives. Seokjin had arrived minutes earlier, exchanging glances with Jimin but saying nothing, because silence was no longer a prison. It was now a weapon, a language, a shared protest. Yoongi stood farther down the corridor, arms crossed, watching through the narrow ICU window slit like a man assessing the structural integrity of truth itself. Namjoon stepped into view last, blocking the doorway not physically but energetically. Leader stance, sentinel posture, protector of timing if not of permission. He didn't speak. He only shook his head once when Taehyung's gaze met his. Not a denial, a calibration. Not now, not like this. But also, you're not alone anymore. Taehyung looked back at Jungkook, heart tightening like feedback pulled into a vacuum. Then a tremor, not dramatic, not metaphorical, real. A physical microseismic shift in Jungkook's fingers, one twitch, then another. Minimal stimulation, maximal detonation. Every member in the corridor snapped into stillness like someone hit a universal pause button on 7 synchronized lives. A nurse rushed in, then two. Machines beeped faster, alarms chirping soft, optimistic, calibrated not for danger but awakening. "He's coming around," one medic said, eyes on the EEG reading. "But stimulation needs to be limited." "No," Taehyung said instinctively, stepping forward. "He needs to hear me." The nurse hesitated only a fraction of a second. Fractions of seconds matter here. Then she nodded once, granting the most dangerous thing HYBE had never known how to handle. A voice delivered at the correct moment. Taehyung leaned down, breath warm against Jungkook's cheek, voice trembling like a vinyl record on the verge of skipping but refusing. "Kook, hey, it's me." Jungkook's eyelids fluttered, brows creasing slightly, awareness assembling itself like pixels loading into resolution. His eyes opened just enough to meet Taehyung. Weak, medicated, fogged by sedatives, but lucid in a way that silenced wars, contracts, shareholders, headlines, and even breathing. "Stop yelling," Jungkook whispered, voice sandpaper soft. "You'll wake the dead." The words weren't biting. They were proof of presence, proof that truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it murmurs. Sometimes it asks for quiet. Sometimes it survives because someone cared enough to trace circles into cold hands and finally speak without fear. Jungkook blinked once. A tear slid from the corner of his eye. Not sadness, effort. The effort of returning to a world that had been arguing about him while he was busy staying alive. Jimin exhaled in relief behind the partition. Seokjin closed his eyes for a second. Yoongi stopped packing. Namjoon unclenched his jaw. Hoseok whispered, "Thank God," but it sounded more like, "Thank truth." Taehyung sat back down, but his hand didn't let go. The cold had warmed by 1 degree. 1 degree is a revolution in an ICU. 1 degree means blood is circulating, life is negotiating, souls are sinking again not to choreography but survival. Outside, reporters still waited, sponsors still panicked, boards still sharpened contingency plans. But in this room at 3:47 a.m., there was only one narrative that mattered, and it wasn't trending because it was loud. It was trending because it was true. The pressure didn't live in the air anymore, it lived in the timelines. By the time the members reached the hospital, the story was no longer theirs to protect or polish. It was already in the wild, multiplying across social feeds, dissected by millions of eyes that believed emotion was evidence and silence was confession. But backstage had taught them a different equation. Truth doesn't grow sharper when it's hidden. It grows sharper when it's feared. The HYBE campus that morning looked calm from the outside. Glass towers reflecting winter sunlight, a sculpture garden that smelled faintly of pine and polished stone, security checkpoints running the same card swipe rhythm they always did. But inside, calm was camouflage. On the 17th floor, where executives usually measured success in orderly bullet points and rehearsal attendance logs, the rooms were vibrating with a crisis they never rehearsed for. Monitors looped, not heartbeats this time but security footage. Not concerts but corridors, not fans but fractures. Namjoon had demanded access to the meeting room anyway, not to plead but to set terms. He wasn't there as an idol. He was there as a leader who had memorized every moment of instability the company had mistaken for liability instead of humanity. Seokjin stood beside him, arms crossed, silent at first, but silence had changed its meaning. It was no longer absence. It was restraint sharpening into resolve. Taehyung wasn't in the boardroom, but his presence was everywhere in the testimony that staff were giving to internal auditors and media risk handlers. Stylists recounted the moment his fist hit concrete. Audio engineers described how his voice broke first, how the words came out jagged and unsteady, more fear than fury. The medical coordinator confirmed that Jungkook had shown signs of physical strain during rehearsals, that something was off long before the collapse, that Taehyung had been the only one who noticed, even when he said nothing aloud. The story had begun as chaos, but now it was transforming into context. Hosok replayed the timeline in his mind as he stood near the ICU glass wall hours later, watching Jungkook breathe in calibrated rhythm. The monitors blinked steady now, stable, but stability is only survival's preface. Taehyung had been packing outside the ICU minutes earlier, replaying the confrontation like a man trapped in an echo chamber of guilt. "I didn't hit him," he had insisted. "I didn't lay a hand on him." And the staff had confirmed it. No one had seen contact. But everyone had seen collapse. Collapse of control, collapse of timing, collapse of withheld truth finally demanding air. The legal liaison had tried to frame it as contract violation risk. Managers had tried to frame it as media optics risk. HYBE had tried to frame it as narrative contamination risk. But the contamination was already in circulation before Taehyung ever sat in front of a camera. The contamination was the assumption that idols break brands when they break inside. The members knew better. The brand didn't fracture in the ICU. It fractured in the hallway, where honesty had been delayed for too long. Taehyung finally sat down near the waiting lounge vending machine earlier that morning, costume still clinging to him like a past identity refusing to peel off. A younger stylist named Ara had whispered to another nurse, "He didn't hurt him. He was hurting." And that was the first time the staff understood what fans would only understand hours later. Jungkook was the headline, but Taehyung was the ignition. Yoongi had stepped into the lounge then, arms crossed, leaning beside him. "They'll pick villains," Yoongi said quietly. "They always do." "Then they'll have to pick both of us," Taehyung replied, voice low, exhausted but no longer fractured. "Because I won't let him carry this alone. Not when he wakes up." He glanced toward the ICU corridor where Namjoon and Seokjin were exchanging silent communication again, leader to member, brother to brother, bond to brand. The room hummed with something heavier than rumor now, consequence and context merging into the thing corporations dread most, unfiltered reality. The members didn't move in formation anymore. They moved in alignment, shoulder to shoulder, not by choreography but by choice. And somewhere deep in HYBE's internal corridors, long before press vans, sirens, and hospital rails, the crisis hadn't been violence. It had been fear of honesty. Fear loud enough to shake fists into concrete. Fear sharp enough to fracture voices. Fear strong enough to block touch until it was safe again. But now, for the first time in the timeline, fear had competition. Not from media, not from contracts, but from the truth assembling itself into inevitability. The kind of truth that didn't need to shout to be believed. It only needed witnesses who were no longer afraid to speak what they saw, even if what they saw was not assault, but a man collapsing under the weight of almost losing someone he cared too much about to lie to anymore. And the ICU monitors kept blinking, steady, quiet, and impossibly honest, as if the machines themselves had already chosen a side, not the side that trended, but the side that breathed. The hallways of Seoul National University Hospital were always busy, but that evening the movement felt different. Not rushed, not chaotic, measured, like a current pulling everyone forward without warning. Fluorescent lights stretched across the ceiling in clean white lines, reflecting off the polished floors that carried the soft squeak of nurses, shoes, and rolling equipment carts. Outside, the winter cold pressed against the glass doors, but inside, the air was controlled, warm, and steady, the kind of warmth that didn't comfort, only stabilized. The scent of disinfectant mixed with brewed barley tea from the staff station, grounding the moment in something unmistakably real. Taehyung stood at the end of the corridor, shoulders tense, coat draped but not worn, hanging off him like an unfinished thought. He had stopped packing, but his body hadn't fully learned stillness yet. His face was pale, not from exhaustion, but from the emotional vacuum left after the explosion had passed. The loudest moments often leave the quietest aftermath. His eyes were fixed forward, locked on the ICU doors where Jungkook remained, as though staring hard enough could bend distance, time, or outcomes. But nothing in a hospital bends for intensity. Hospitals demand patience, the one emotion idols never train for. Earlier that day, a junior nurse named Mincio had overheard the staff discussion. It wasn't anger, she said. It was terror wearing anger's mask. And the phrase traveled fast, not online, not publicly, but internally, where real narratives are born before they're discovered. The staff had replayed the moment of Jungkook's collapse over and over, not because it was suspicious, but because it was unprecedented. They had seen idols faint before. They had never seen another idol punch concrete because of it. Jimin was the first member allowed inside the ICU after visitation clearance. He moved quietly, no dramatics, no trembling words, only presence. His hand hovered near Jungkook's bedrail but didn't touch, not because he feared headlines, but because he respected fragility. The monitors hummed a gentle rhythm, green waves pulsing on black screens, wires neatly routed like lifelines drawn by engineers who believed order could assist survival. Jungkook's breathing was calm now, supported by oxygen that whispered instead of intruded. His body looked small under the clinical blankets, but smallness in a hospital isn't weakness, it's honesty. Hosok and Namjoon were stationed at the nurse's desk, exchanging updates like field commanders in a war where the only winning strategy was information, accuracy, and compliance with care. No emotion, no sentiment, no speculation. Just data about vitals, hydration response, fatigue indicators, and neural calm recovery markers. The kind of facts that don't trend but save lives. Seokjin wasn't speaking much either, but he was observing everything. The staff's expressions, the shift changes, the tone of the doctor's voices. He knew something fans didn't. Medical staff don't hide concern well. Their eyes betray first. Yoongi sat in the adjacent family lounge, legs crossed, headphones around his neck but no music playing. The lounge was minimalist, designed for waiting, gray couches, a low table, a stack of health pamphlets no one ever reads, a water dispenser bubbling faintly in the corner like a metronome for quiet endurance. He watched Taehyung through the lounge's open doorway. No judgment, only recognition, because Yoongi knew emotional implosion intimately. He simply survived his silently. A doctor named Professor Kang eventually approached the members, posture composed, clipboard held low like a diplomat carrying neutral news. "He'll recover," Professor Kang said, "but rest must be enforced after discharge. This was collapse by accumulation, not incident." Namjoon nodded once. "Then the incident wasn't the fall," he said. "It was everything that pushed him there." Taehyung overheard it from the corridor and exhaled again, slow, controlled, intentional. Not a sigh, not relief, not defeat, just recalibration. Because now he understood what the staff had already documented. His emotional outburst hadn't endangered Jungkook. The denial of concern had endangered him. Taehyung's fist hadn't been violence, it had been punctuation. Jimin finally stepped back into the corridor where the others waited. He didn't ask for anyone, Jimin said softly, but he relaxed when he knew we were here. Taehyung nodded. Not emotional this time. No cracks, no fracture. Just a man absorbing the truth that had almost arrived too late. The hospital was doing its job now. The members were doing theirs. HYBE would do its job later, spin, contain, publish statements. But jobs don't save people. Alignment does. And for the first time since the collapse, the story was no longer about outbursts, concrete walls, or withheld apologies. It was about 7 men standing in a hospital corridor, realizing that the scariest risk wasn't losing control of narrative, it was losing someone while trying to control it. And the ICU doors remained closed, but not ominous. Hospitals don't close doors to shut people out. They close doors to keep someone alive long enough to walk through them again. Night settled over Seoul like a curtain made of glass and quiet exhaustion. The hospital windows reflected the city's skyline, Han River glimmering faintly in the distance, bridges stretching like silver threads connecting two halves of a city that never sleeps, even when its idols collapse under the weight of trying to keep up with it. Inside the building, time moved slower, thicker, weighted with beeping monitors and unspoken reflection. Hospitals have their own time zone, one ruled by breath, pulse, and waiting. Jimin had remained unusually quiet since stepping out of the ICU earlier. He sat between Hoseok and Yoongi, hands folded, elbows resting on his knees, head bowed slightly, not in prayer but processing. Taehyung stood across from them, leaning his back against the cold concrete wall of the emergency stairwell, coat finally worn properly now, arms crossed not out of defiance but containment. The wall was cold, grounding him, a reminder that not everything solid is a threat. Sometimes it's a witness. The staff had stopped glancing at him like a ticking bomb. Instead, they watched him like an anomaly they finally understood. Not volatile, not dangerous, human. When idols break the script, people always panic first, until they realize the script was the thing breaking them. A security guard named Deho, who had been stationed near the ICU since afternoon, approached the members earlier with bottled water. "You boys always stand like the world depends on it," he said, voice gravelly but kind. "Today it did," Seokjin replied simply. "No drama, no metaphor, just fact-wearing empathy." Namjoon, who had been reviewing medical advisories with Professor Kang, returned to the corridor where the others were waiting. His face carried fatigue but not doubt. "Jungkook's oxygen dependency will be reduced by morning," he informed them. "But his body is running on borrowed rest. We can't interrupt that." Taehyung looked up immediately, eyes sharp, focused, alert. "Then we stay," he said quietly, "even when he doesn't know we're here." "Especially when he doesn't know," Yoongi murmured back. The truth had mutated again, but not into rumor, into clarity. Clarity is rumor's antidote, and it spreads the same way, fast, inevitable, unstoppable when enough people witness it independently. The staff had reconstructed the incident internally, not as a breach, not as violence, not as scandal, as a warning sign ignored until it screamed through a body hitting a rehearsal floor. Jimin eventually stood up from his seat in the hallway. "I kept thinking his collapse started today," he said softly, "but it started in every moment we were told not to worry." Taehyung pushed himself off the wall then, posture straight, breath controlled. "And I kept thinking my outburst was the loudest part," he said. "But the loudest part was everything that was kept quiet before it." Hoseok nodded, a faint smile forming, not one of humor. One of shared realization. "HYBE built us to be loud on stage," he said. "They forgot to build a system for when we get loud off it." The emergency coordinator, Ms. Choi, had walked past the members earlier that night, pausing briefly when she heard their conversation. "You don't have to defend the moment," she said gently. "We saw the moment defend him." Taehyung absorbed that quietly, because he knew the world outside would eventually demand a villain, a culprit, a narrative with sharp edges and blame shaped like a person. But villains are easiest to assign when emotion lacks context, and context was finally circulating freely, carried not by press releases, but by witnesses whose loyalty was not contractual. It was personal. A doctor on shift change stopped near them as well. "Your friend will wake up," he reassured, "but make sure the world lets him rest when he does." The corridor returned to silence again, but not empty silence, educated silence, the kind that listens instead of hides. Taehyung glanced toward Namjoon. "Tomorrow they'll try to frame this as disruption. Then tomorrow we frame it as survival," Namjoon answered instantly. "Not story." Jimin exhaled again, nodding. "Not story," he echoed. "Person." And the ICU monitors blinked steadily beyond the doors. The machines didn't care who trended as villain or hero. They only cared who kept breathing long enough to step into the morning. The night held them all in suspension, but no longer in confusion. Confusion belongs to the undecided. They had decided, not against anyone, for someone, for Jungkook, for the truth that protected him, for the reality that almost slipped through their hands, not because it was weak, but because it was delayed by fear wearing protocol. The hallway lights dimmed slightly on auto night mode, but the warmth remained, because some truths don't need brightness to be seen. They only need witnesses who are no longer afraid of their own voices, even when those voices are exhausted, quiet, or leaning against a wall that finally tells a different story. Not one of damage, but one of proof that honesty, even when punched into concrete, can sometimes arrive just in time to save a life that no contract ever had the right to own. Morning in Seoul arrived without announcement, but it never arrived quietly. The sky above the hospital was washed in winter blue, soft gradients reflected on the glass facade like nature's attempt to imitate calm. In the distance, Namsan Tower stood firm on the hill, wrapped in a faint haze that made the city feel cinematic even when reality refused to follow a script. The streets below were already humming, delivery scooters buzzing past convenience stores glowing with warm orange interiors, pedestrians clutching hot coffee from paper cups stamped with logos no one memorized, steam trailing upward like visual proof that life had resumed its ordinary pace. Ordinary, of course, for everyone except the 7 men who hadn't slept inside it. Taehyung sat in the hospital courtyard just after sunrise, finally still, breath visible in the cold air. The courtyard was a small, rectangular pocket of greenery bordered by stone tiles and thin birch trees whose white bark glowed softly in the early light. A sculpture of 2 open hands stood near the center fountain, abstract enough to avoid meaning but poetic enough to attract it anyway. Water rippled in quiet pulses, reflecting light in broken shapes that reminded him too much of last night, fractured but decipherable if you looked long enough. He wasn't punching anything anymore. He was watching, because vigilance was the new aftermath. Hosok joined him with 2 warm cans of yuzu tea purchased from the courtyard kiosk. No words at first, just the metallic click of the can opening, then the warmth of the drink spreading through cold palms. "You good?" Hosok finally asked, not emotionally, not dramatically, just humanly. "I'm present," Taehyung answered. "That's the only good that matters right now." Upstairs, the ICU had begun shifting its posture too. Doctors spoke with quieter concern, nurses moved with calmer steps, and the machines blinked the same unwavering green they had blinked all night. Jungkook was still unconscious, but unconsciousness in recovery is not disappearance. It is incubation, and the staff knew it well enough not to mistake stillness for loss anymore. Jimin had been leaning against the ICU corridor wall again, head tilted slightly, eyes half closed, absorbing the morning shift sounds. The hospital didn't allow crowds, but it allowed presence. And presence was the thing BTS had finally chosen without hesitation. Seokjin stood nearby, reviewing the updated medical notes with Namjoon again. No structural injury, no internal bleeding, severe dehydration, physical collapse from prolonged strain, Namjoon read aloud quietly. Stable, responsive to oxygen reduction. Expected consciousness return within 24-48 hours if uninterrupted. Taehyung looked up when Hosok relayed the update to him downstairs. He nodded once. No theatrics. No tears. Tears had already served their purpose last night. This nod was different. It was acknowledgement without surrender. HYBE representatives arrived mid-morning, but even their arrival lacked the confidence it once carried. Two executives, one legal officer and a PR coordinator stepped into the lobby, shoes silent on the polished tile, coats dark, expressions neutral by design. Neutral is the company's favorite emotion. Neutral leaves no fingerprints, but neutrality had failed them yesterday. Yesterday had fingerprints, emotional ones, concrete ones, human ones. Namjoon met them before they reached the elevator. "We'll cooperate with medical protocol," he said, "but not with narrative protocol." The legal officer blinked, not offended, just outpaced. "The statement is scheduled for review by noon," the coordinator informed. "Good," Seokjin replied. "Make sure it sounds like a human wrote it this time." The hospital staff didn't interrupt the conversation, but they observed it. Observers are the new publishers of truth, long before public feeds ever received the final version. And the staff had already published the only verdict that mattered internally. Taehyung's fist hit concrete, not a person. Jungkook's body hit exhaustion, not betrayal. And betrayal had been shouted by someone who feared losing narrative control, not someone who feared losing a life. Professor Kang finally approached the members again during rounds. "When he wakes," the professor said gently, "let him see familiarity before explanation." The members nodded collectively, not choreographed, synchronized by concern. Taehyung eventually stood up from the courtyard bench, yuzu tea still warm in his grip. He began walking toward the elevator again, steps steady, coat properly worn, eyes forward. Not guilty, not defensive, not performative, just resolved. The vending machines blinked behind him with their neon beverage advertisements looping endlessly, irrelevant to the story now. Because the story was no longer looping. It was progressing toward consciousness. When Jungkook finally woke hours later, his eyes opening faintly, pupils adjusting to the clinical light, oxygen cannula lighter now, breathing unassisted but monitored. The first thing he saw was not a statement, not a camera, not public interpretation. He saw Namjoon's silhouette, Jimin's quiet posture, Seokjin's calm observation, Yoongi's folded arms, Hosok's warm gaze, and when Taehyung stepped into his peripheral vision, Jungkook didn't flinch. He exhaled. Because familiarity was innocence's first witness. The world outside would interpret it later. HYBE would publish it later. Fans would discover it later. But the hospital had already confirmed it first. And BTS had already chosen it first. Because survival doesn't ask for trending sides. It asks for present ones. And for the first time in this escalating narrative that had lasted long enough to fill an hour, the ending wasn't rupture. It was alignment. Not the kind forged by contracts, cameras, or curated dashboards, but the kind forged by corridors, winter breath, concrete impact, and a bond that refused to collapse even when one of them physically did.